So ladies and gentlemen, we're delighted to be here. My name's David Thoreau. I'm the president of the Independent Institute. And our panel, as you may know, is entitled Pope Francis and Free Markets. George Gilder is our panelist as well, and he's scurrying up here. The panel is based around a recent book that the Independent Institute produced, which I'll mention in a moment. The focus of this session is with his emphasis on service to the poor and care for the planet. Pope Francis commands the attention not only of the world's 2.2 billion Christians, which includes 1.3 billion Roman Catholics, but also of the people across the religious divide. In his 2015 encyclical, entitled Laudate Si, the pontiff called for an open dialogue about poverty and the destiny of what he calls, quote unquote, our common home. This invitation is the inspiration for the Independent Institute book, which is called Pope Francis and the Caring Society. The book is a respectful but utterly clear critique of Francis's embrace of big government, command and control, and redistributionism, as well as what could be called junk science, to achieve his goals. Our panel will discuss insights from this widely acclaimed book. In the process of issuing his encyclical, and to his great credit, Pope Francis invited a dialogue, and the book is in response to that invitation. We have three panelists who I'm pleased to introduce briefly. The first is Robert Whaples, who is a research fellow at the Independent Institute. He's professor of economics at Wake Forest University, managing editor of the Independent Review, and editor of the book Pope Francis and the Caring Society. The second panelist is Dr. Lawrence McQuillan, who is senior fellow and director of the Center on Entrepreneurial Innovation at the Independent Institute. And our third panelist is George Gilder, who's a founding member of the Board of Advisors of Independent Institute and a best-selling author of numerous books, including Wealth and Poverty, most recently The Scandal of Money, Knowledge, and there's just a whole number of books, Microcosm and so forth. We're thrilled to have George here. So without further delay, I will turn it over to Professor Whaples.
So in the encyclical Laudate Si, Pope Francis uses the term dialogue 25 times, and this book is really an attempt to engage in dialogue with the pontiff. And it's mainly a reaction to the encyclical Laudate Si, which has been called the environmental encyclical, but I'm going to bring in a few other points the Pope has made since then, especially the publication a couple of months ago of the economy and pecuniary questions, the first time that the Church has made official statements on finance and banking. So, first let me say that it's not just Pope Francis who's been talking about these things. Many of the things that Francis has been saying about the environment and the economy have been said by his predecessors, John Paul II and Benedict. He does kind of strike out in a new direction from the two of those two. So let's bring ourselves to that. What I want to do now, which is what I did in the introduction, is engage in dialogue. So if I, representing all economists, were to sit down with the Pope, here are things that I think I would say to him, and then I'm going to have what the Pope would say back drawn on his very words, okay? And the economist will then kind of respond to what the Pope says, and the Pope will close by responding to what the economists say. So here's how the economist opens. They say that capitalism has a very good track record in being a caring society. Capitalism works really well. It produces for us things that we all care about, like efficiency, growth, freedom, and creativity. So think about the problems that capitalism solves best. It works very well because it can solve the three big problems that Friedrich Hayek pointed out. Those problems are the knowledge problem, the incentive problem, and the learning problem. I think most people in this room know about these arguments. So imagine yourself. You're out on the back 40 and you discover a big lump of metal. And you say to yourself, wow, this metal, it looks pretty, but I can pound this thing out and make myself a nice flat sheet out of this metal, and I can use it to patch a hole that I have in the roof of my hut where I live. And so I do that, and it's not long until somebody comes by and says, what have you filled the hole in your roof with? It looks to me like that's gold. And I go, gold? I don't really know much about gold. What's that all about? And they say to me, you fool, don't you realize how expensive gold is? That stuff sells for $1,000 an ounce. You could sell that stupid thing you patched the hole in the roof with and buy yourself a complete new home and not have to live in the dumb hovel that you live in anymore. Okay? So what the market has done is provided me with knowledge that I didn't have before. Knowledge about how valuable this thing is. And you might think that's a fanciful example, but in fact, in 1799, Conrad Reed discovered a 17-pound gold nugget on the back 40, and they used that gold nugget in his house as a doorstop. Knowledge is a powerful thing. So what the market does is send me a signal about how valuable something is that I might not have known, things that I might know very well about myself, but I don't know about what other people know about them, that powerful signal of price. Second, it solves the incentive problem. If I have a resource and I own it, I don't have an incentive to waste it. I have an incentive to use it wisely and efficiently. Then it solves the learning problem. Maybe I didn't solve the problem too well of using my resources well, and I earn a loss. Maybe I solved them well and earned a profit. The market sends me that signal and tells me, hey, loss maker, you need to change how you do things. Or profit maker, good going. And then everybody else, yeah, good going for me too, because I'm going to steal that guy's ideas. And so that's what the market does so well, right? It gives us that incredible efficiency. Now, what we often overlook is that because it solves that problem so well, it then sets up a dynamic. That dynamic is to accelerate technological improvements, to eliminate absolute poverty. That's what it's done, to generate rising standards of living, longer life expectancies, better education, more leisure time. Under this market system, the rich get richer, and the poor get richer as well. The market does these things without coercion. Fourth, the market actually diffuses power. A lot of people think about how the market concentrates power in the hands of just a few, but that's not actually how it works. Most of the power goes into the hands of the consumers. William Nordhaus from Yale did a little calculation in a paper a few years ago and estimates that 97.5% of the gains from entrepreneurship in recent decades has gone to consumers, making us all better off. The market unleashes creativity. So that's how the conversation begins, with the economist pointing out the strengths of the market to Pope Francis. But Pope Francis is a wise man in a wise tradition, and he has some things to say back to this. First thing he would point out is that, yes, capitalism incentivizes people to reduce their costs, to do things efficiently from their point of view, but also to ignore costs that they impose on others, what we call social costs. I can pollute and cut my costs if I can get away with it. I can use up a bunch of resources that aren't owned by anybody if I can get away with it. What else does capitalism do that's not so good? Well, you talked about how it creates all this extra output for us. That extra output means that we actually have rising levels of pollution. More automobiles means more pollution. Better and better technologies for fishing can mean that we catch all the fish, and they pretty soon start to disappear from the oceans. Then the Pope would say that if you look at it, we're actually producing more than the earth can sustain. Probably his most famous line in Laudato Si, when he says that the earth, our home, is beginning to look more and more like an immense pile of filth. Even if the market can produce things that didn't damage the earth, the Pope says something that we rarely hear, and that is that it's producing things for us that we don't really need. that people simply have too much under this system. We're getting spoiled. He says in Laudato Si that markets tend to promote extreme consumerism, and people can easily get caught up in a whirlwind of needless buying and spending. Possessions are so dangerous, says the Pope, because they lead you immediately to vanity. You believe you're important, and when you believe you're important, your head swells and you become lost. Then the Pope would say that capitalism generates high levels of inequality. The rich are far removed from the poor and vainly show off all their possessions, their supposed superiority to the poor. Capitalism, let's face it, the Pope would say, encourages and feeds on envy. And envy is one of the deadly sins. Capitalism can lure people into focusing on crass material things. We know that it does. The Pope calls this frenetic activity that we all get sucked up into. It panders often to our worst nature. Sex sells. I saw that this morning walking around the streets of Las Vegas. And it can lead us to be distracted from the true light by all the lesser lights that it sets in front of us. Capitalism overemphasizes the individual to the detriment of the collective. It erodes social capital and communal bonds. Capitalism puts a price tag on everything, the Pope would say. Steve Forbes, I saw him up here earlier today. How much is that guy worth? I mean, dollars? No, that's not how we should value how much people are worth, is it? Then the Pope would say that workers and the poor are often exploited by capitalism. They don't get their fair share. And employers often view them as just mere objects, dismissing them when they're no longer needed and subjecting them to harsh working conditions if they can get away with it. Capitalism is plagued by booms and busts, the Pope would point out. And capitalism is also plagued by this cronyism, the rent-seeking, the businessman capturing the state to get him to do his dirty work. So the Pope's got the ball back in the economist's court. What does the economist say back to this? The Pope summarizes by saying, look at it, markets are out of control, direct quote. They're not capable of governing themselves. Business can be a noble profession if it's directed to the common good, if it is directed toward improving the world and creating jobs and benefiting all of the stakeholders, rather than mere profit. So let's give the economist a chance to speak back. And I think the economist would say this. I agree with your last point about crony capitalism, number 12 on our list. Bad. Argentina, a lot of crony capitalism. Not the way it should be done. Let's avoid that. But let's go back and think about the environment. You've missed a couple of points, a couple of key points. Capitalism, with its markets and property rights, incentivizes people to think long-term. Because they own the property, they're not going to just use it up and abuse it now. They realize that if they husband their resources, they're going to become more valuable over time. They're going to conserve the valuable resources and not ignore the future because they're the owners. If you think about it, the worst environmental problems in human history have occurred in systems where capitalism is not flourishing. Look at Haiti and the Dominican Republic. On the Haitian end of the island, things are brown and the trees have been cut down. Not so on the other end of the island, because property rights are securer in the Dominican Republic. In Haiti, your property rights aren't secure. You know the people in the government and their friends can come and steal whatever you have anytime they want. So you cut down your trees before they get a chance to, and pretty soon the half of the island gets denuded. In fact, we're not running out of resources. You can see in the picture Haiti versus the Dominican Republic, but you can see in the next picture over that we're not running out of resources. Okay? That picture is a graphic of the real price of commodities over the last few decades. Adjusting for inflation, the price of commodities is heading down. They're getting less scarce over time. That's some powerful market that can do that, making resources less scarce even after we continue to use them up. Capitalism has made people wealthy enough to demand a cleaner environment. I look around and I don't see the environment looking like an immense pile of filth. I think it does in some places, in poorer countries, but not in richer countries. Economists call this the environmental Kuznets curve. I've got one graphed out there. It's the amount of sulfur dioxide emissions in the United States as a proportion of what was emitted in 1900, and we're comparing it to the income in the US, again, as a proportion of 1900. You can see that the sulfur dioxide emissions rose as we got richer, but then it peaked. We got to a certain point where we were rich enough and said, we can afford to clean up this mess. I don't like this. I can afford to put a catalytic converter in my car. We can afford to burn cleaner fuels. And that's exactly what we've done in countries around the world. The richest countries have the cleanest environment now. Capitalism seems pretty environmentally friendly by that. Capitalism enables people with their wealth to become much more charitable, and that's what Lawrence is going to be talking about. Capitalism, next, incentivizes people to be more virtuous and to serve each other. Did you ever think about it that way? Capitalism gives you an incentive to be nice and treat people decently because they'll want to do business with you. Next point, capitalism can set an example of how people can cooperate to solve problems. Capitalism is all about people cooperating with each other. Workers rarely do get exploited under capitalism. They can be exploited if they don't have multiple opportunities. But in a capitalist system, there are many employers, and that's when the worker gets to escape the exploitation. And finally, in fact, inequality is not rising around the world, and absolute poverty is shrinking drastically, as you can see by the numbers there from the World Bank. So The Economist has pulled out some numbers and some concepts to rebut some of the things that Pope Francis has said to fill in some of his blind spots. But we can't let The Economist entirely off the hook here because we have our own blind spots. So let me close with a few final thoughts from Pope Francis. He reminds us that purchasing is always a moral and not simply an economic act. We have to realize that. He tells us that the constant flood of new consumer goods can baffle our hearts. It certainly does. It can prevent us from cherishing each thing in each moment. It's a return to the capacity to be happy with only a little, which can allow us to stop and appreciate the small things. He says that many people realize that our current progress and the mere amassing of things and pleasures are not enough to give meaning and joy to the human heart. Capitalism is a means. Markets are a means. Wealth is a means, not an end. The end is eternal. We should have a capacity to walk away from the things that markets give us if those things are the wrong things. More is not always better. He says that many things need to change, but of course it is we human beings that need to change the most. Okay? Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Lawrence McQuillan. I'm Senior Fellow at the Independent Institute, and I'm also an economist. And I got interested in the economic views of Pope Francis for one reason, and that reason is that he's a media rock star. No matter where he goes around the world, he commands huge media attention. He has a platform wherever he goes to present his views to a large audience. So I thought it was important to speak truth to power, and that's how I got interested in looking at the economic views of Pope Francis. And I have one of the chapters in the book that we're going to do a book signing for right next door after this panel, Pope Francis and the Caring Society. And in my chapter, I'm not questioning his sincerity or his intentions, but I am criticizing, respectfully, I believe, his economic assessments and his policy recommendations. So in terms of his economic assessments, time and time again we hear him say that capitalism and globalization lead to poverty and inequality. And on those 2 points, he's just absolutely flat out wrong. From 1991 to 2013, the percentage of the world's population living in absolute poverty fell from 42% to 10%. Let me restate that one more time for emphasis. The world's population living in the worst poverty conditions fell from 42% to 10%. And only, by the way, 25% of American citizens, when they're polled, understand that world poverty has actually fallen. So we have a huge lift in terms of educating the public on this. 500 million people in China lifted themselves out of crushing poverty after pro-market reforms were enacted. More in India were lifted out of poverty. In terms of income inequality, if you look at a common measure of inequality, which is the global Gini value, it fell from 72.2 in 1988 to 67 in 2011, and a lower Gini value means less inequality. And again, that's largely due to rising prosperity in China and India. But still, 900 million people live on less than $1.90 a day in the world, 900 million people. But their best hope for a better future is capitalism. Capitalism is and always has been the greatest wealth creator the world has seen. And to emphasize what the Pope doesn't understand about capitalism is that wealth must first be created before it can be used to help others. And capitalism is the greatest wealth creator in human history. If you want more wealth and private charity, I'm going to emphasize private charity in my talk right now, and I'll talk about more on that later. But if you want more wealth and private charity to help the poor, you want to encourage capitalism. Because again, wealth has to first be created before it can be given to others. Carol Park and I co-wrote a chapter in Pope Francis and the Caring Society book that looked at the relationship between the institutions of capitalism and private charity. So we looked at the relationship between private charitable giving and economic freedom, and private charitable giving and private property rights around the world. So this was a global perspective that we looked at. And we have a couple of graphs that I can put up here. So in order to look at world giving, we use the World Giving Index by Charities Aid Foundation, which looks at private charity in 145 countries around the world. We measured economic freedom using the Economic Freedom of the World Index by the Fraser Institute. And as this graph shows, as economic freedom increases around the world, private charity increases around the world. And in fact, the variation in economic freedom explains 20% of the variation in giving around the world. So it's a huge driver of private charity around the world. In the next slide, we show the relationship between property rights protections and private charity. So we use the International Property Rights Index by a group called the Property Rights Alliance to measure property rights protections in various countries around the world. And we find again that an increase in private property protections leads to an increase in private charity. The variation in property rights scores between countries explains 25% of variation in giving. So private property rights actually drive more of private giving than economic freedom in the aggregate. So in summary, the ability to create wealth, to secure wealth with private property, and to transfer that wealth easily to other people are key drivers of private charity, and all of these factors are important institutions of capitalism. Why do I focus on private charity? Why do I find that the important aspect to emphasize in the research that I did? Primarily, its bottom line is private charity is more effective giving than government redistribution. Unfortunately, in 2014, Pope Francis gave a speech at the United Nations where he called for more government redistribution and taxation to help the poor. He advocated for more government-to-government transfers, a more active role for international organizations in redistribution. But as these graphs earlier showed, more taxes and redistribution undercut the institutions of capitalism and attacks the very heart of wealth creation and private charity. So the very things that he advocates for in terms of taxation, redistribution, more government intervention are the very things that undercut his goal, which is to help the poor around the world. Transfers to government by other governments, whether it's government-to-government aid or redistribution from international organizations to government, has been shown consistently with research, props up corrupt governments, often lengthens wars, and hurts the poor around the world. We have the research of Deaton, Boone, Easterly, Moyo, Bauer, Radelet. All of these studies are talked about in detail in my chapter in Pope Francis' book. But the bottom line is decades of experience show that the approach of government redistribution and government-to-government transfers has been a moral and practical failure around the world wherever it has been tried. And unfortunately, it's been tried too often in too many different places. In contrast, private charity has been a much better track record at home and abroad, both in terms of efficiency, which is more bang for your buck, less of the money is eaten up by administrative costs and more of it reaches the intended recipients, and also effectiveness in terms of the dollars lifting up people out of poverty and allowing them to be prosperous individuals on their own. So in conclusion, if Pope Francis wants to help the poor most effectively, he should encourage capitalism worldwide and private charitable giving, because capitalism is one of the greatest blessings in human history. Thank you.
Well, Pope Francis has been speaking out at a moment of crisis for world capitalism. And it is most deeply a moral crisis. And it stems in great part from errors and misconceptions that originate among the defenders of capitalism themselves, beginning even with Adam Smith, who is kind of the great saint of capitalist philosophy. Adam Smith essentially adopted the idea that capitalism is chiefly an incentive system, that it's kind of the entrepreneur operates in a kind of Skinner box. He responds to carrots and sticks, rewards and punishments. He is an instrument of his environment. And this model of capitalism as an incentive system glides into a concept that capitalism is driven by greed, that somehow envy and greed actually propel capitalism to higher achievements. And some libertarians have even adopted the greed is good mantra. And of course, we explain it away with all sorts of refinements. These incentives coincide with a service of the society. But still, the view that greed leads as by an invisible hand to an ever-growing capitalist society is a fundamental misconception. Really greedy people want unearned rewards. And the best way to gain unearned rewards is by collaborating with government. And so greed, in fact, leads as by an invisible hand to an ever-growing welfare state, to crony capitalism, rather than to the productive, creative activities that we really associate with enterprise when we examine it closely. Pope John Paul II and Centesimus Annus showed the path out of this regime that has preoccupied Pope Francis. In Centesimus Annus, he wrote, "In our time, there exists another form of ownership beyond land, labor, capital, all the usual driving forces of capitalist progress. There's another form of ownership which is no less important, far more important indeed, and that is the possession of know-how, knowledge, and skill. Wealth of the industrialized nations is based much more on this kind of ownership than on the ownership of natural resources." And Pope John Paul spoke of a worldwide solidarity of capitalism in which the ability to perceive the needs of others and satisfy them is critical to the success of economies. And in other words, the golden rule, this is really the fundamental principle of capitalism. Capitalism is based on the altruism of enterprise. Capitalists do well by serving others, but it's not only that they do well, the profit, which somehow Pope Francis seems to believe is a reflection of greed, is in fact an index of altruism of enterprise. Profit measures the difference between your own valuation of goods and the value that your customers put on your output. And that difference is a kind of index of the degree to which your enterprise is serving others more than yourself. If you actually pursue your own interests first, you will fail in enterprise. You have to respond to the needs of others. You have to collaborate with others. You have to, and the most crucial index of your success is going to be how much you enrich your society. And the largest untapped markets in the world are always among the poor. As the poor ascend in wealth, the opportunities of capitalists everywhere increase. So I believe that at Discovery Institute, I've been working on an information theory of capitalism that begins really with Albert Hirschman's insight that we need creativity. Creativity always comes as a surprise to us. If it didn't, we wouldn't need it. And as I put it, socialism would work. Socialism would actually produce a caring society if you didn't need creativity. But creativity comes as a surprise to us. And Claude Shannon, the pioneer of information theory, shows that information itself, the elements of knowledge, are defined by surprisal. The information itself is unexpected knowledge, unexpected bits and a bit stream. And so the information theory that underlies our entire world information-based economy ultimately reposes in creativity as a surprise. And if entrepreneurs most truly are creators in the image of their creator. That's the essence of the role of human beings as envisaged in an information theory of capitalism. And I hope in the next years that the information theory of capitalism will begin to prevail over the incentive theory of capitalism. And I believe that it's a completely coherent explanation. Wealth is knowledge. And it must be, because we entrepreneurs today have the same material resources that the caveman commanded. The material doesn't change. All progress, everything that differentiates our age from the Stone Age comes in the advance of knowledge. And what advances knowledge is learning. And a capitalist society proliferates learning everywhere. Each enterprise is the test of an entrepreneurial idea. And entrepreneurial ideas can only be successfully tested and yield knowledge if they are falsifiable, if they can fail, if the government intervenes to support its cronies and guarantee results supposedly to benefit the poor in a caring society, it prohibits the advance of learning. And the learning is economic growth. If wealth is knowledge, learning is economic growth. But the crisis of capitalism that has arisen in recent years, I think, is largely derived from the collapse of money. That money has become a form of wealth in itself rather than an index of wealth, a measuring stick of wealth. And in order for prices measured in money to guide entrepreneurial activity, you have to have money as a measuring stick rather than as a goal, and rather than as an instrument of government manipulation. And this is a crisis of capitalism that derives from a betrayal of its fundamental principle of scarce money, which provides a measuring stick through the price system for all the activities of entrepreneurs across the economy. So creativity comes as a surprise to us, yet all innovation and all new wealth comes from these surprises of creativity provided by entrepreneurs, creative in the image of their creator. Thank you.
Thank you to our panelists. You can see the interconnected theme of the Pope Francis and the Caring Society book, and George bringing up a deeper point of the natural law tradition that I think that we've gotten off in the modern epoch. We have time for some questions. Raise your hand. We're happy to address them.
From a biblical standpoint, I would say that the idea of, outsourcing the idea of being virtuous and good and helping others to the government is something deeply actually expressed against in the Bible. My two examples of this would be in Corinthians, where it says, give to others not because you're forced to, but because you're in your heart you want to give to people. This was something that was very profound to me, because the idea of force is not really charity. You're not giving because you are a morally good person. You're giving because you're just being forced to. And God says you're not supposed to do that for Catholic school. You're not supposed to give because you're supposed to go to heaven. You're supposed to give because you're a human. The other is the story of Jesus talking about taxes, where he says, give unto Caesar's what is Caesar's. Well, so what does that mean? Does that mean his work in itself is separate from the government? Wouldn't that kind of imply that if it says that he wants to give it Caesar's what's Caesar's, that his work of charity and good faith and caring among humans is separate of that of the state? So I see it as something that's anti-biblical and something kind of directly against what God said, because I see socialism and that kind of idea as the outsourcing of goodwill. Would you kind of agree with this assessment or no?
That's a good statement. I agree with it. That is the moral foundation of capitalism.
Yeah.
And in my chapter in the book, I mean, I talk a lot about how there is no moral value gained from forcing others to do what you think is the moral act, right?
Yeah.
It actually makes you the immoral person. And I think we need to really hammer home that message much more than what we do in the freedom movement, because that's what's driving so much of the welfare state, is this idea that if I force others to do what I think is noble, somehow it makes me more noble as a person. And it's just simply not true, as you stated.
And you saw that one of the things I had on the list is that the free market, the capitalist system, achieves what it does without coercion, right? So agreed.
Yeah. I'll let everyone else talk.
I mean, one other way to look at it is essentially what progressives believe in the modern world is that the virtues, the classic virtues and the golden rule and so forth are obsolete, and the end, instead the end justifies the means, which is actually a contradiction, because whatever standard you use to exalt an end, whatever standard you say that's an objective good, that also must apply to every means, because every means is also an end. Any other questions? I mean, your work in wealth and poverty and so forth relates to what you just discussed.
Well, you know, for all my life, I've been frustrated by this effort to make economics mechanistic. And that is what Pope Francis really is rebelling against, this mechanistic model of capitalism. Right. And the new threat comes from the idea that human beings themselves are machines, and ultimately can be excelled by better machines that are generated from Silicon Valley. Artificial intelligence can somehow obsolete the human being. And I think it's a crucial mission of the church to oppose this idea. I call it the materialist superstition, that somehow human minds can be usurped or excelled by machines. There are completely different categories of minds and machines. Machines, by definition, can't generate surprises. If surprises in a machine are breakdowns, they're bad. You don't want surprises in a machine. But human surprises can be creative and redemptive and providential. And so that's why this is an important vision and mission of the church, to counteract the increasing tendency to diminish. First, Darwin diminished us to animals, and now Silicon Valley is diminishing us to machines, and the creative human figure is eclipsed in both these philosophies, which are totally contrary to the Christian insight and vision.
Right. I mean, we are not matter in motion, or as one scientist at MIT once said, we're not computers made of meat, because if we were, that person would not be able to infer anything, because the inference would be determined. Robert, is there anything else you, as the editor of the book, you want to add?
I think one important point needs to be made, and that is that the Catholic Church has had a teaching, fundamental teaching, called subsidiarity. That teaching is that if there's a problem to be solved, it should be solved on the level at which it will be best solved. And sometimes you read Francis and get a sense that he doesn't grasp that principle as well as he should, kind of having a bias toward top-down solutions, when in fact, problems of fixing the environment and especially alleviating poverty have been shown to be solved so well at a much lower level, especially at the lowest level of the individual and of the household, and then moving up toward the community, that we've been able to solve the absolute poverty problems around the world. But we should never diminish, I think, what Pope Francis is trying to achieve in reminding us that we're not machines made out of meat or something like that. That in fact, God created us and created the universe with a purpose in mind. That in his infinite goodness, he created this so that we could share in his own blessed life. And so we shouldn't get pulled away so much by the material things of this world that we do let them, like these lights up here, distract us so that we can't actually see the audience, so that we can't actually see what's important in life. And we have solved our material problems pretty darn well. And I think maybe we should start thinking a little bit more about those more eternal problems.
Lawrence, you're director of the Center on
well
Entrepreneurial Innovation. Anything you want to add?
Well, I just think that the view that capitalism is driven by consumption is another error that is prevalent and actually is answered in part by Mark Skousen's new gross output measure of the economy that includes all the activities of businesses as well as the final sales to consumers. And in the gross output model, consumption becomes a much smaller part of the economy, and it corresponds to the supply side insight. Economies are not improved by compulsive consumption. That's a complete delusion. Economies are driven by sacrifice, discipline, love, reach into the future, support for your families, aspirations for eternal reconciliation. It's not an economy driven by consumption and greed. And to just understand that is really critical. And I think that part of the problem is us. The defenders of capitalism all too often succumb to demand-side figments that actually are morally empty.
Very nice.
And so the bottom line of the book is to agree with Pope Francis on his call to create a more caring world to address the economy, the environment, and charity because of this mechanistic tendency we've seen in the modern era. And as George and the others have pointed out, enterprise and creativity is something that defies the machine. So there'll be copies in the book store to the right of the exhibit hall, and Professor Whaples will be there to sign copies. I want to thank our panelists,
Thank you.
and I want to thank you all for joining with us.